So now we set up the project. We work on iteration number 3 to create the contact types, or to set up the model, really, contact type. So we'll apply the same 3 steps: problem formulation, and define the scope. And the scope here will be to create a type to represent the contact information, and create a type actually to represent the contact person, not the contact information. Create a type to represent the list of contacts as a source for the contacts data. How are we going to test this? So testing here, because we're not going to have a user interface at this step, so we can test using the log by printing out values from the log, or we can delay the testing until the next step, or we can do something called unit testing. And unit testing is a little bit beyond the scope of this module, but you can look it up how to do unit testing, and you should be able to follow through the instruction when you find it. So we'll say here in the testing, test with iteration 3, with iteration 4. So step 2 is the solution formulation, and we have the model, and that's most of the work here, where we're gonna create a class to represent a contact person with the first name, last name, and email as the data. If you look at the PDF document associated with this module, you'll see this slide that shows the diagram for a class. So the diagram for a class is a software unit that represents a concept in the physical world. So in the physical world, we are different people. Each one of us has names, email, different information to connect with them. And so we will represent that concept in the software world using this class. So it has a name, and then it has two different groups of information, or one of them is called attributes, and the attributes are the characteristics that represent that concept in real life or in the software. So the attributes are usually the nouns or the data that can be associated with that concept. So attributes, for instance, is the first name, the last name, and the email address. These are all attributes of or characteristics of the contact person. The other group of items or members of a class is called the functions, or the behavior that functions, and the functions are verbs that represent the behavior of objects of that class. So what does a contact do? So a contact can be initialized, meaning that you initialize its properties to different data. A contact can be encoded or decoded, and you may think of other functions that you can do with a contact as well, and these will be different functions. So we will create a class that has 3 attributes: first name, last name, email, and you can add more attributes if you would like, and it will have initializers so that we can initiate a class. And the purpose of initializing a class is to set up a value for those attributes. So we're going to have 2 initializers, one that sets up to a default value, and then the second that initializes it to a set of values that the user would be interested in. To the contact person and as the data or attributes, and 2 initializers to initialize the data. We also need to create a class to represent the list of contacts as a source for the contacts. A source for what? The table view controller, when we get to it to display the list, it needs a class that that represent the data, that become the data source, or that provides the data and process any functionality on the set of data. So we're gonna create one. You're not gonna see a value for that class until we get towards the end of this module, into the enhancements and saving the data and loading it from a file. But up until then, this will behave very much similar to the collection, which is the NS mutable array that we're going to use as we discussed in iteration 1. Use NS mutable array as a collection of the contact objects. For the view, no work on the view in this iteration, and in the controller, no work on the controller in this iteration. So when we come to step 3, solution implementation, what we need to do is to create those classes. So create a class for the contact person, and notice I use upper cases to represent the class, to represent the class name. So create a class for the contact person, and then create a class for the contact person data source, and then that will be it. So let's go ahead and start working on that. So to create a class, you can right click in the project navigation area and say new file. You can also click on the plus right there in the bottom and says new file, or you can go to the menu and say file and new file. You don't see it there. We'll do the plus, new file, and it will open the new file template. We are in the iOS. Notice there are multiple templates, iOS, and we'll add a CocaTouch class. So next, we need to give the class a name. So we will name it ContactPerson, and the name of the class represents the concept that we are modeling, and it is a subclass of NS object. In the past, when we created a new custom controller, we used to subclass UI view controller. We are not creating a class to behave as a controller, so we're gonna subclass this NS object, which is the root class for all classes in the library. And the reason you don't have to do that, but the reason we do that is there are certain behaviors that are expected, and when you extend this class NS object, you inherit those expected behaviors, so you don't have to worry about them. So extend, and the language is Swift. I want to keep it in the project group, and then say create. And here is the class ContactPerson NS object, and there's nothing inside the class. So we need to add the different attributes. So the attributes values will change every time in the different functions. There will be changes. Data will go in, data will leave, and gets updated. So we'll use var to create the class attributes, and then we need to give it a name. So we'll say first name, and then you need to provide a type or data. So I'm gonna provide the type a string. So this defines the first attribute for the class. Notice that Xcode will be complaining, and the complaint will be that you have it without any initial value. So it will recommend to you to provide an initial value, nothing like that, So you can do this. I'm not going to do that because I'm creating an initializer, and I want you to go through that experience. In the previous modules, when we created attributes inside our custom controller, we provided an initial value for it, or used the exclamation mark. Notice here, once I use the exclamation mark, it will get rid of that warning. And the initial exclamation mark basically tells Xcode that I understand the risk of creating or defining an attribute without providing an initial value. So it kind of suppresses that warning, and it's a way for you to think through what exactly you are doing here. I am taking this out because I'm adding an initializer. So then var, and then I'll say last name, and this will also be a string, and then email address, and this will also be a string. Notice I'm using what is known as the camel case for the attributes. First letter is lowercase, but if it's more than one word, then the words after that are uppercase. Then we need to create the initializer. So if you start typing initializer, you'll see that the init function is there, and the init function is a member of the NS object. So Xcode will give you here and say, you're overriding that declaration, meaning that there is already a function called init in the NS object class, and we are adding, we are changing the definition of that function. So to indicate that we know that we're doing that, Xcode requires us to add this override. So now that we added the override, Xcode is still complaining and saying that you are overriding, but you did not yet initialize those attributes. So I can go ahead and initialize the attributes. So I'll say first name equal, and then maybe I'll give it my name. This will be kind of a sample. So I'll say last name equal, and then email address, and you can put some information here. What is left here is that we have not run the steps in the initializer from the NS object. So the init function exists in the NS object, and we need to run those functions, that the steps that exist in that function. So I'll say super, and there's an init function there, so I'll run those after I initialize the class. Then I need to add another initializer, so I'll say I want another one, but this second one cannot be the same name and same attributes. Xcode will complain here and says that this is something you've already used. I want to give the user the ability to pass data for me, or give me data to initialize the attributes using that data that the user will give me. So I will say that I want to initialize with first name, and then I will, and this will be a label, and then I provide a name, so I'll say first, and the type is a string. So this means that I'm creating an initializer that receives from the user data, and I'm giving it a local name called first. The type is a string. My objective from this is to use this first as the data to initialize the first name. And then I need another one, so I'll say that I also need second, and I can provide a title for that. Not second, I'll say last name, and then I'll use last, and that is also a string. And then email address, and then I will use email and a string. This format might be interesting for you. What is happening here is that the first one is like a label. It's not the variable name or the type. And instead of when you'll see when we create the second class or try to use contact person and initialize a contact person, Xcode will show us the titles or the labels that we are providing here, instead of showing us that it is first the variable name, which variable name may not mean anything to whoever is going to use the contact person, but it could mean so we'll use the label instead, and the labels are explicit to tell the user what they need to enter in here. So in the init, it's still complaining because I need to initialize, because there's a possibility that the user will call this function instead of calling the other one. So I'll initialize my attribute first name, but instead of providing a coded value, I'll use the variable that's in my parameter list. So I'll use first, and then go again for the last name, and I will use the variable for the last name, and then the email address, and I will use the variable for the email address. And then at the end, to make sure to run the init method in the initializer. So this is creating a contact person class and providing two initializers. It has three attributes and two initializers. The first initializer has fixed data initiated into the different attributes, and the second one has dynamic data that is passed by whoever uses this class. So let's go ahead and use the class in creating the contact data source. So I'll create another file, ContactPerson class, and we're gonna call this the contact person data source. So this is a class that will serve as a source for the contact person. And we'll say where we're gonna save it, and it's the same. So what are the attributes that I have here in this class? I have one attribute which will be the list, the collection of the contacts. So I will say the collection of the contact is not gonna change. So I'll use lit and say contacts, and I will use and the type for those contacts is NS mutable array. And you can initialize it here, or I will say no, let's not initialize, or you can initialize. So maybe instead of defining it, let's just initialize NS mutable array. And here are multiple ways to initialize a mutable array. I'm just going to use the default one. So contacts as an array, as a collection, is not going to change. But what's going to change is what goes inside it. So this is why I used let, because the name contact or the variable context itself is not going to change. But what goes inside it, that's what will change. So what I want to do is, once you initialize this contact person, I need to load some contacts inside that class. So I can say here, so I can add a function called load contacts, and then have whoever uses it load the contacts, or I can load the contact myself. So if I provide an init function here, and this will have to be override, and in the code I need to initialize the original one, and then I need to load the contact. So I can say load contacts, and I'm gonna create it in a function of its own. So I'll say function load contacts, and then I need to create a couple of contacts and add them to the array. So I can say, for instance, yeah, we can say let sample1 equal contact person. Here is the contact person class, and if I try to initialize, see there are two initializers for the contact person. One that is empty and another one that tells you that first name, which is a type string, last name and email address. So the label that I used replaced the actual name of the parameter. So I'm gonna use the first one here to give me the first sample contact, and then add that contact to the mutable array. So I'll say contacts, which is my mutable array dot add, and then I will add the sample one. Then let's create another sample. So we'll say let's sample 2, and the sample 2 will say is the contact person, but this time we'll provide a different contact. So we'll say we want to pass on data as a string, so you can pass on data for your favorite person. So John Doe, and I'll provide an email address to John Doe, and then add those to contacts. So I can add to contacts directly, or I can add my own function to add contacts. So I can say add contact, and this means that you need to provide a name, a parameter to add the contact to. So we'll say here contact and then C and the type is contact person. So the user will then give me the contact, and what I will do is add this to my contact. So add and then use the C. So for sample 2, instead of adding directly to the contacts, I can use my function and add sample 2. This is a better approach, especially if adding the contact will require you to do some type of processing. If you want how many contacts are there, we can add a function to provide a count of contacts. And this function does not need to receive any parameters, but it will need to provide back an integer representing the count of those contacts. And we discussed this before. When there is a return, this means return that whoever is using the function needs to receive back an int, and to pass the int back, you use the keyword return, and then we need to provide how many they are. So the mutable array has the count function, which returns, and it is not a function. I think it's no, it is count. Yeah, it is a variable. So we don't need to use parentheses or anything. And then I can provide another function if you want to retrieve an individual contact at a particular index. So I say contact at index. And then in this case, I need to receive the index. So index, and this will be of type integer, and no return, or actually it does need to provide a return value, and the return value in this case will be a contact person. So we need to return that. So I'll say return contacts, and contacts will have the object at index, but it is returned as the any type. So the index is the I that I received, and because it is any type, I have to convert this to a contact person so that it returns as a contact person. So I created the contact person class data source. It has one attribute, and then it has an initializer that loads the contact with some data. In this case, I'm loading it with some sample data. But as we mentioned before, we have an iteration later on to save to a list. So when we get to that iteration, we can load the data from that list, and then add the contact. So if you want to use it to add a contact, get the count of contact, and get contact at index, you can use it for that. So that completes both steps and completes iteration number 3. So in the next iteration, we will, in the next iteration, we will use the contact and contact person and contact person data source to populate a table view controller and be able to see the list of contacts displayed. Thank you.